This is Ken Pyle, and we're at the Broadband Community's 2013 Summit. We're actually on the trade show floor, the exhibit floor, and we're with Tim Scott of Axia. Now, Axia is doing some interesting things with regards to operating networks for municipal and publicly owned type networks. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of your recent efforts?
Sure. So I'll just focus on what we're doing in the United States. We've done a lot of stuff internationally, but what we've done in the US recently is we were selected by a quasi-government entity in Massachusetts called the Massachusetts Broadband Institute, which received about $70-odd million of state and federal funding to build an 1,100-mile new aerial fiber network in western Massachusetts. And they serve what are called connected anchor institutions. So they're like the schools, the libraries, the town halls, those types of public sites. But they needed an operator to actually run the network. And so Axia, through a long-term procurement process, was selected to be the long-term network operator for that infrastructure. So our role is really to operate all the electronics that sit on the fiber asset that connect these anchor institutions. And we offer a series of lit wholesale products to retail service providers who compete to provide service to the end user site. So if you think about your school may be able to choose from a series of 20, 30 service providers by which they buy their 100 meg service for the school, but the retail service provider is buying the wholesale service from us, the transport service from us back to their internet point in Boston, typically.
Now, is the 1,100-mile network, does that actually get down to the school level, or are you stopping off in the towns kind of as a point of presence?
It's actually, so the 1,100 miles of new fiber is right out physically to the school sites. Okay. So there's 1,200 sites that, they're not all schools, but 1,200 of these connected community anchor institutions across 120 odd towns, and the investment, the $70-odd million, is building fiber to the premise in those sites, including the electronics device that actually sits in the site, and then our role is to operate that, provide those wholesale services and NOC services that sit on top of that infrastructure.
Now, is the network built out yet?
No, it always takes a while. Yeah, we've been at this a couple of years already, and but we're in the last push for the finish line here. We've got about 4 or 5 months to go. A lot of the fiber network has been deployed on the poles, which took a long time to go through the make-ready process. And really now we're focusing on the larger towns that have conduit where the fiber has to be deployed, and all the drops to those community anchor institutions.
So now, want to get to the operations part in a second, but first, I guess as far as this was stimulus type money that funded it. So with that financing, kind of gone now, do you see the opportunity for other areas where they need mid-mile, where maybe they could do this just based on the economics of the actual selling to retailers and so forth?
Yeah. The answer is, I guess, it always depends. I think in this particular area of Western Mass, it is truly underserved and unserved because no private sector entity could really make a business case. So without stimulus or subsidies, there would be no fiber in Western Massachusetts. I think what's interesting is the next step by which now this middle mile footprint sits in Western Mass, and that can be leveraged to create last mile extensions to connect to businesses that haven't been connected because they were precluded from stimulus dollars, and ultimately to do residential fiber to the premise. So certainly Axia has an interest in trying to figure out a new model for that with the quasi-government entity, the Massachusetts Broadband Institute, that we work with, which still will require some subsidies to make the model work, but it's probably more typical of like a PPP type structure, a public-private partnership structure, where you've got some public dollars involved, but it requires private dollar capital to kind of make the final model work.
Well, that's interesting. Have you seen that yet with maybe a community seeing, oh gosh, we've got the fiber here now, and we've got these businesses that need connecting, where they're actually either creating like a municipal network, or, if you actually have a case of that happening yet?
Yeah. We're starting to see that in the United States. Axia doesn't really have a case in the United States that reflects that. We've done a similar project in Singapore, which is fiber to the premise to a million premises in Singapore, which is a very different type of business model here. But the market is moving rapidly in North America, particularly in the United States, I would say, towards municipal type examples. Obviously, Google has created a lot of interest with their two initiatives, most recently in Austin and prior to that with Kansas City. But ultimately, we see a point in time when municipalities have to figure out what can they bring to the table, and for us, from a public-private partnership perspective, there has to be a mix of some sort of capital contribution, ideally some sort of assets that they either own or they're prepared to invest in, fiber assets, and ideally they can bring some sort of committed spend to the table, because ultimately it's a very hard business model to create unless you have some of those inputs that are coming from the partnership. And then there's still a big gap for the private sector to fill, which will be more capital to complete the job, to connect to all the premises, and ultimately to bring the operational expertise and operational dollars to the table too, because once it's built, the ongoing operational costs are obviously very significant.
Yeah, and from an operational standpoint, have you had much experience there yet as far as real world? Are you getting the kind of expense ratios that you'd expect, from an all-fiber network? Again, though, it kind of depends on the geographies. I mean, certainly with our initiative in Massachusetts now, we really understand what all those operational costs and variables are. But that would probably be very different from what we see as our operational costs in Alberta, as an example, or very different from our operational costs in Singapore, just because each market is very unique. So Western Mass mightn't even be typical to another state, but now we know what those variables are, and they involve everything from pole attachment fees to co-location costs to be in the carrier hotels, to IRU costs, to maintenance costs. So you can't really control them, but you know what they are, and your business model obviously has to be able to figure out, well, how do we cover those annually, and it's a pretty sizable number. Well, and I would imagine that rural is probably more expensive than urban. Is that with operational or not? On operational, I don't think it really depends. Obviously, the cost to build can be less in rural and more expensive in urban, but it really depends. If fiber is available at an ongoing, somebody wants to sell it to you, whether it's rural or urban, the numbers can be a bit of a wash. But the ongoing operational costs, I think we've seen, can be pretty similar, rural or urban. Okay, just for some of these other factors come into play then. Yeah, exactly. Well, Tim, I appreciate your update here, and good luck with the rest of the build-out. Thanks very much, Henry. Cheers.